The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, each drop a percussion note in the symphony of my rage. In my hands, I held a letter that had arrived that morning, cream-colored paper with my mother's distinctive handwriting, the same careful cursive that had once left notes in my lunchbox before everything went to hell. "Dearest Marcus," it began, and I nearly crumpled it right there. "We know it's been far too long, but we've never stopped thinking about you. 15 years. 15 goddamn years since they drove away in that rusted Honda Civic, leaving me standing in the driveway of Uncle Richard's mansion with nothing but a garbage bag full of clothes and a heart full of confusion. I was 13 then, still believing they'd come back once they got back on their feet, as Mom had promised through her tears. They never did. Uncle Richard found me there 3 hours later, still standing in the same spot, still clutching that bag. "Well," he'd said in his gruff way, "I suppose you'll be needing dinner." That was Uncle Richard. Never one for emotional displays, but his actions spoke louder than words ever could. He took me in without question, gave me everything I needed, and asked for nothing in return except that I make something of myself. And I had. God, how I had. At 28, I was the youngest senior partner at Blackstone and Associates, one of the city's most prestigious investment firms. My portfolio was worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. I owned properties in Manhattan, the Hamptons, and Aspen. I drove cars that cost more than my parents' annual income back when they'd actually had jobs. But success hadn't filled the hole they'd left behind. It had only made it more pronounced, like a missing tooth that your tongue can't stop probing. I read the letter again, my jaw tightening with each saccharine word. They were in trouble, of course. Mom had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's, and Dad's construction business had failed. They'd lost their house, their savings, everything. The letter painted a picture of two broken people who'd made mistakes and were now facing the consequences. "We know we have no right to ask," the letter continued, "but we're desperate. We've heard about your success, and we're so proud of you. If there's any way you could find it in your heart to help your old parents." My old parents. As if they'd earned that title by contributing anything more than DNA to my existence. I set the letter down and walked to the window, watching the city blur through the rain-streaked glass. In the reflection, I could see Uncle Richard's influence in my posture, my expensive suit, the way I carried myself with quiet authority. He'd died 2 years ago, leaving me everything and, more importantly, leaving me with the tools to handle exactly this kind of situation. The plan formed in my mind like a chess game, each move calculated and precise. I picked up my phone and dialed my assistant. "Sarah, I need you to track down some information on Michael and Linda Harrison in Columbus, Ohio. Everything. Financial records, medical information, current living situation, and I want it by tomorrow." "Of course, Mr. Harrison. Should I ask what this is regarding?" "Family business," I said, tasting the bitter irony of those words. The next morning, Sarah's report confirmed everything in the letter and more. They were living in a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. Dad's business hadn't just failed. He'd been sued for shoddy workmanship and had liens against everything he owned. Mom's condition was progressing faster than expected. They had maybe 6 months before they'd be completely destitute. Perfect. I called them that afternoon, using the number Sarah had provided. Mom answered on the second ring, and the hope in her voice when she heard mine was almost enough to make me reconsider. Almost. "Marcus?" "Oh my God, Marcus, is it really you?" "Hello, Mom." The word felt foreign on my tongue. "I can't believe. We sent that letter, but we never really thought—" "Oh, honey, it's so good to hear your voice." "I got your letter," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I'd like to help." The sob of relief that came through the phone was genuine, and for a moment, I felt something twist in my chest. Then I remembered the 13-year-old boy standing in that driveway, and the feeling hardened into something cold and useful. "I'm going to arrange for you to come to New York," I continued. "There's a medical facility here that specializes in Alzheimer's treatment. I'll cover all the expenses." "Marcus, we can't possibly—" "It's no trouble," I assured her. "Family takes care of family, right?" The irony was delicious. Within a week, I'd arranged everything. A luxury medical transport brought them to the city, and I'd set them up in a beautiful suite at one of Manhattan's most exclusive senior living facilities, the kind of place where the monthly fees exceeded most people's annual salaries. I made sure they had the best doctors, the finest amenities, and more comfort than they'd known in years. I also made sure they knew exactly who was providing it all. I visited them regularly, playing the role of the dutiful son who'd forgiven their past transgressions. Dad broke down the first time he saw me, apologizing through tears for abandoning me. Mom, when the medication gave her moments of clarity, would squeeze my hand and tell me how proud she was of the man I'd become. "We were so young when we had you," she said during one of our dinners at the facility's five-star restaurant. "Too young and too selfish. We thought we were doing what was best, but we were just running away from our responsibilities. The important thing is that we're together now," I told her, cutting my Wagyu beef with surgical precision. But we weren't together. Not really. This wasn't reconciliation, it was theater. And I was both the director and the lead actor in a play whose final act they couldn't see coming. I let them get comfortable. I let them believe in redemption, in second chances, in the healing power of family love. I attended medical appointments with them, celebrated small improvements in Mom's condition, and even helped Dad explore new business opportunities that would never materialize. For 3 months, I gave them hope. Then I began taking it away. It started small. The premium medical coverage I'd arranged developed administrative issues. Appointments were delayed, then rescheduled, then canceled altogether. The suite they'd grown to love became unavailable due to renovations, and they were moved to progressively smaller, less luxurious accommodations within the facility. Dad noticed first. "Marcus, I think there might be some confusion with the billing," he said during one of our weekly dinners. "They're saying our account is in arrears, but didn't you handle all that?" "I'll look into it," I promised, knowing exactly what they'd find when they investigated further. The financial records I'd arranged were masterpieces of creative accounting. On paper, it looked like I'd been covering their expenses with a trust fund that was now depleted. Legal documents showed that their care had been contingent on the availability of those funds, and with the trust empty, they were responsible for nearly $500,000 in accumulated medical and living expenses. Mom's condition worsened under the stress, the progression of her disease accelerating as her world became uncertain again. Dad aged years in a matter of weeks, the weight of their situation crushing him beneath its inevitability. "I don't understand," he said when we met to discuss their situation. "The lawyers are saying we owe all this money, but you said it was taken care of." "I thought it was," I replied with practiced concern. "I'm looking into legal options, but Dad, you have to understand, I'm not legally responsible for your debts. The trust was set up by Uncle Richard for your care, but with it depleted." I let the implication hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The facility gave them 30 days to arrange payment or alternative living arrangements. I watched Dad scramble, calling old friends, distant relatives, anyone who might help. But what help could they offer two elderly people facing debts they'd never be able to repay? It was during Mom's particularly bad episode, when she didn't recognize either of us and kept asking for her baby boy Marcus, that Dad finally broke. "Why?" he asked me in the hallway outside her room. "Why are you doing this to us?" I looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the gray hair, the lines around his eyes, the way his hands shook from stress and exhaustion. He looked exactly like what he was, a broken old man paying for the choices he'd made 30 years ago. "I'm not doing anything to you," I said calmly. "I tried to help, but resources aren't unlimited. Sometimes life just doesn't work out the way we hope it will." Recognition dawned in his eyes then, slow and terrible. "This is about when we left you." "Left me?" I stepped closer, and he instinctively backed against the wall. "You mean abandoned me, cast me aside when taking care of your own child became inconvenient. We were young, we were stupid, we... You were parents." I cut him off. "And when that became too difficult, you decided it was someone else's problem." "Well, congratulations, Dad. Now your problems are someone else's responsibility too." The color drained from his face. "Marcus, please. Your mother is sick. Whatever you think we deserve, she doesn't deserve this." Didn't I deserve better when I was 13? Didn't I deserve parents who wouldn't abandon me the moment things got tough? The words came out sharp and cold, each one a blade finding its mark. "You want to talk about what people deserve? You deserve exactly what you gave me. Nothing." The confrontation should have felt satisfying, but as I watched Dad crumble in that sterile hallway, I felt only empty. The victory I'd planned for 15 years tasted like ash, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The machine I'd set in motion was too precise, too well engineered to halt now. They were evicted from the facility the following week. I arranged for them to be transferred to a state-run nursing home across town, the kind of place Uncle Richard had once described as warehouses for people society has forgotten. The contrast between their previous accommodations and this final destination was stark and intentional. I visited them one last time, finding Dad in the common area of the nursing home, staring at a television he wasn't really watching. Mom was in her room, lost in the advancing fog of her disease, no longer recognizing either of us. "I want you to know," I told him, "that this isn't random cruelty. This is justice. For 15 years, I built myself into someone who could do this to you. Every success, every achievement, every dollar earned was in service of this moment. You taught me that family means nothing when it becomes inconvenient, and I'm simply applying the lesson you gave me." Dad looked up at me with eyes that held no anger, only profound sadness. "What kind of man have you become, Marcus?" The question hit harder than I'd expected. "The kind of man you raised me to be," I replied, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. I left them there and drove back to my penthouse, expecting to feel the satisfaction of a job well completed. Instead, I found myself standing at the same floor-to-ceiling windows where I'd first read their letter, looking out at the city lights and feeling more alone than I had in years. Uncle Richard's voice echoed in my memory. "Success without compassion is just elaborate revenge against the world, Marcus. Don't let your pain turn you into someone you won't recognize in the mirror." I'd thought I was honoring his memory by using the tools he'd given me to craft this perfect retribution. But standing in the home he'd left me, surrounded by the life he'd helped me build, I realized I'd betrayed everything he'd actually taught me about strength, dignity, and what it truly meant to be a man. The next morning, I drove back to the nursing home. I found Dad in the same chair, looking like he'd aged another decade overnight. Mom was having a good day and actually recognized me when I entered her room. "My successful boy," she said, reaching out to touch my face. "I always knew you'd do wonderful things." The innocence in her voice, the pride unmarred by knowledge of what I'd done, shattered something inside me that I'd thought was unbreakable. I spent the day making calls, rebuilding what I'd so carefully destroyed. By evening, they were back in private care at a different facility, one I would genuinely support for as long as they needed it. I established a irrevocable trust to ensure their care would continue even after I was gone. But I didn't tell them it was me. I couldn't face the gratitude, the hope, the possibility of forgiveness I didn't deserve. Instead, I arranged for it to appear as if Uncle Richard had left a final provision in his will that had only just been discovered. A trust specifically for their care that reflected his belief in taking care of family, even when they'd failed to take care of each other. I never saw them again. Dad sent me letters occasionally, expressions of gratitude and confused attempts to understand what had happened. I never replied. Mom's condition continued to decline, but she had the best care available, and Dad remained by her side until the end. She passed away 2 years later on a Tuesday afternoon in spring. Dad followed 6 months after that, his heart finally giving out from the accumulated weight of years and regret. I attended both funerals from a distance, watching from my car as they were laid to rest in a beautiful cemetery I'd never visited and would never visit again. There were more people there than I'd expected. Friends they'd made in their final years, staff from the care facility who genuinely cared for them, distant relatives who remembered them as they'd been before everything went wrong. Standing at Uncle Richard's grave afterward, I finally understood the difference between justice and revenge. Justice heals wounds and restores balance. Revenge only creates new wounds, deeper ones, that fester until they consume everything around them. I'd gotten my revenge, perfect and complete. But in achieving it, I'd lost the only part of my parents that had ever mattered: the possibility of understanding, forgiveness, and the kind of peace that comes from choosing to be better than the worst things that happen to you. The 13-year-old boy who'd been abandoned in that driveway had deserved better. But he'd also deserved to grow into a man who could rise above that abandonment, who could transform pain into compassion instead of cruelty. I'd built an empire on the foundation of my anger, but I'd forgotten to build a life worth living inside it. The rain started again as I walked back to my car, and I found myself thinking about the letter that had started it all. In the end, my parents had been right about one thing: they had no right to ask for my help. But I'd had the right to give it anyway, not because they deserved it, but because the man Uncle Richard had tried to raise me to be would have found a way to heal instead of hurt. I kept their letters in a drawer in my desk, unread reminders of the choice I'd made and the person I'd become. Sometimes, late at night in my empty penthouse, I wondered what my life would have looked like if I'd chosen differently. But some roads, once taken, lead to places you can never come back from. The only thing left was to live with the consequences and try, somehow, to become worthy of the love I'd been given by the one person who'd never abandoned me, even if I'd abandoned everything he'd tried to teach me about what it meant to be human. In the end, my revenge had been perfect. It had also been perfectly empty, a hollow victory that cost me more than my parents' abandonment ever had. But that's the thing about revenge. It's always a feast that leaves you starving,